Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for today is Erin Straza. She's a sought after Chief Donor Engagement Strategist. Erin assists nonprofits in making their missions irresistible to donors. Her approach to core messaging and relationship building produces the stability necessary for organizational growth. After earning her MBA at Illinois State University, Erin worked in corporate marketing and then taught marketing communication strategy at Illinois Wesleyan University. She is a published author, conference speaker, former podcast host, and avid reader. Welcome, Erin. Before we dive into our topic today, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself personally so our audience can get to know you as a whole person?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, I am in central Illinois, right in the middle of the country, which makes it really easy to work with clients from coast to coast, which is so fun. And I guess another personal thing about me, I love exploring, traveling, going to new places, and that always involves taking all the books with me and finding all the local coffee roasters because I've just got to find all
Nice.
the good
I love
coffee
coffee too. I
everywhere.
actually used to own my own cafe. Yeah.
Really? Well,
Yeah, in
that's
another
amazing.
lifetime. Anyway, but here we're going to talk about funding, and I love thinking about, especially for nonprofit leaders, the intersection of how you kind of set up your organization and run it is so closely linked to like how you communicate even to your staff and how you communicate your donors. It's all often interlinked. So I mentioned in your bio about making missions irresistible to donors. So why don't we start there? What makes your mission irresistible to donors?
Well, there are lots of things that go into that, but when I think about a mission that's irresistible, it is something that donors connect to at that heart level. Initially, I mean, it's like, oh, there's something going on in the world. They don't like how it's going, and they're thinking, I must get involved. I must do something about whatever this issue or problem is. And it could be anything. I mean, there are so many nonprofits with all kinds of missions. And therefore, there are lots of donors who are interested in a lot of different things. And it's like, two souls finding each other across the divide. It's like, oh, you are doing this thing and I care about this thing. So we should work together. Um, for a nonprofit org, so often what I see is that nonprofits have a hard time clearly articulating that there really is an urgent problem that needs to be solved. Um, Teams, very rightly so, don't want to sound overly negative. And so it's like, how do you frame a problem that needs to be solved? It's terrible and we want to fix it, but you want to say it in a way that doesn't sound like you're negative Nelly. And so that's what I try to do with teams, try to help them say, here is our clear problem and issue. We don't like it. Our donors don't like it, but we have to at least start there to say there's a problem and we've got to solve it. And that makes that mission irresistible to donors because I realize, oh, somebody else thinks like me. Somebody else cares like I do. I want to be part of this. So helping the donors see the true problem, that's the first thing. And then I always say the second thing is making sure that donors understand that their role is essential in solving that problem and for the mission to be accomplished. So often in communications, it's so hard. I have to check myself, even in my work and with my clients, to make sure that who's the center of attention here? It's the outcomes, it's what we're accomplishing. It's not, yay, we're doing it, we're doing it. It's more like together, we are all wanting something different. So let's all work together. You've got a role, we've got a role, the community's got a role. Let's all be in it together. And then that makes everyone feel like they're part of it and they have a role, they're essential, that they can do something in particular.
Yeah, I love that. So A couple questions and points that you're welcome to disagree with me on. One
Sure.
thing when I hear people talking about making missions clear that
Yeah.
I would just want to make sure there's clarity on is I've seen a lot of organizations interpret that as that they need to change their mission statement to be this like super marketing message. And
Yeah.
I often like to tell like your mission statement can be a very concise, clear, ultimate, like your North Star goal. And then you can have,
Definitely.
but you don't, it doesn't need to do all your marketing messaging for you. You can have
Yeah.
that you talk about it, right? You can have
Yes, all
all
the
the
words.
words. You don't have to
Yes,
try to
yes,
make
yes.
some sort of concise mission statement, do all this heavy lifting. Um,
One of the funny things I see with mission statements, I'm curious if you see this. Whenever I see a mission statement that is too vague or lofty or something like that, I always think you could submit or substitute any other org in here, and it could be anybody's org. And so my feeling is make it, short and snappy if you want, or longer if you want, but as long as it's your mission, like what are you particularly doing? And very often, if you're not a word person and you don't know how to do it, that's when you bring in other people who can shape it if you need to reshape it. But yeah, that particular mission statement, I'm not so worried about. It's
I
how
take
you're talking about it all the time. That's
that's
what I'm
right.
more worried about.
Yeah. And, I take my clients through, I have like this kind of
Yeah.
rubric framework for like fleshing out your mission, right? And it's got, so it has to be unique
Yeah.
and specific and, clearly address some sort of clear issue with some sort of specific
Yeah.
desired result and maybe a specific method sometimes that you're really committed to using. But then after that, like the statement itself, if people understand it, great. If it doesn't gel together, there's like amazing writers
Right.
who can make it gel. But we don't need it to gel if
Yes.
it's clear internally for building out strategy, and then we can have amazing
Yes.
writers
Yeah.
put this stuff together. The other thing that I was thinking about was, just you. I think you're so right in this hesitancy to really pull out the
Yeah.
problem and talk about how bad it is. And that's so important because when you have that, the
Right.
dark
Right.
side of it, right? I think the dark side and the light side, the bad and then the good result, you get contrast. And when you have contrast, people can see. But if you don't really pull out the problem, you lose contrast. And something with contrast is just mush, which goes right back to what you said about so many mission statements. Just read like, we're on a mission to blah, 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 blah,
Right.
blah, blah.
I mean, everybody wants to make the world a better place. Of course you do, but how and what's specific to you? And so, yeah, I think you're so right is that the contrast and seeing how things are today, you don't want it to be like that tomorrow or next year. And so, what is it that we can do to change that? And if you don't have that clarity of like where you're headed and what you're trying to accomplish, donors will be like, I don't know why I'm walking with you. Why, if you're not really, there isn't really a problem to solve, then why would I support you, partner with you, give you my time, effort, energy? So you kind of got to build that case. One of the funny things too is that whenever I hear that little bit of hesitancy about defining the problem too starkly, it's the assumption that that's all you're going to say all the time. You're going to just say crisis, 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 problem. It's all an issue. Where it's more of that narrative and weaving of the whole story. It's like you've got lots of things to say. Again, there are lots of words, there are lots of angles, but one part of it has to be the problem so that people know what to do.
So, sometimes, people might struggle with really identifying the problem. What are some other common challenges that you see donor teams or small or large facing as they're thinking about cultivating those relationships with donors? I know as I'm thinking about this, I immediately think I always hear clients saying like, I don't know what to say to somebody new, or how do I find somebody new? But I'm so curious because this is kind of your day to day. What do you see? What are those challenges?
Well, a couple of different things. That challenge of how do you connect with donors and make sure they understand that mission, it is a lot of work. I mean, I like to think of it because, again, communications hat on. Every problem in a nonprofit is probably somewhat communications related because communications support relationships. And it's all about the relationships with the donors, with the people you're serving, with your community. And so many of those relational breakdowns come because of communication problems. Like any relationship, communication is an issue. And even as someone who loves communications, I swear I love it because I struggle with it. And I'm like, ooh, I want to figure it out. And I'm not perfect at it, but it's like, let's try this, let's try that. So many nonprofits, they don't have enough wiggle room to try things and maybe adjust. Um, uh, I don't think I don't think they have enough staffing, first of all. Most nonprofits are so understaffed, then they're all stressed out. And so then they're just scrambling. I see a lot of scrambling and I hate that for nonprofits. Um, there's something about the the urgency of the day to day. Like you've got all the work, but then there's all the funding elements. And too often, those are all being handled by the same person. And it's really hard to divide that time and attention between the execution of the mission and then how do we get this mission partnered up and fully funded. And so I think that's a real problem. Do you see that a lot with nonprofits not being, yeah, fully?
100%. I mean, I have a whole webinar
Oh my
on why you need to
goodness,
staff
yes.
up. And I say in that the number one problem nonprofits have, they think it's money, it's
I think so
actually being
too.
understaffed. And there are two reasons I find nonprofits don't have enough money. One is being understaffed, because I find again and again nonprofits come to me saying, we don't have enough money. And I say, all right, let's look at all the
Yeah.
functions of your nonprofit. And when it comes to bringing in the money, like, whose full-time job is
Right.
this? Nobody's? Well, that's why you don't have the money. The other thing I see with funding is nonprofits trying to kind of like, they're dabbling in all these different
Uh-huh.
forms of fundraising and not doing any
Yeah.
one of them
Yeah.
really well. And in general, or they're focused on totally the wrong activity, which often they're focused on grants when they should be focused on
I
major
would agree
donors,
with
in my
that.
opinion. You know, nine
Yeah.
times out of 10, I think organizations need to really lock in their, I don't call it major donors. Now I have some
Oh,
new language I've been using. I call it high touch relationship
yep.
fundraising and
I like
scaled
that.
relationship
Yeah.
fundraising. So, because high touch, it could be and who defines a major donor, but this is where you're
Yeah.
putting your one-on-one attention and you got to dial that in. It's where you can bring in a lot of money and it costs very little to set
Yeah.
up initially. And then your scaled relationship fundraising is where you've got, your
Yep.
big mailing campaigns
Yep.
and your digital fundraising and your social. And that actually takes there's a lot in it, and it takes a lot of expertise and pieces to set up well. So usually I encourage people to kind of do that next after they've got their high touch kind of dialed in quite a bit.
That's fascinating that you are using that language now because was just working with a client in this last year and they were struggling with that same phrasing of like, oh, top donors, low level donors, like that just sounds weird. And so they decided, and we worked on these new naming conventions, and they're talking about them more like, what's the engagement level that the person wants? And there are some people who are like, yeah, I'm just going to give you $25 a month and I don't really have time for you. I care enough, but this is it. This is all I'm doing. That's the experience they want. And maybe they'll grow, in the donor journey. But then for the people who are super committed, like they're the champs and they love it, they're highly interactive, but maybe that means top dollar giving. Maybe that means they are on your socials all the time, like. But either way, they're highly invested. And so it's like, how do you talk to those people, not so much by the dollars, but by the interaction? I like that a lot. It's creative.
And the messaging can go like across high touch and scaled, but the tools, right? Because you physically can't call, 10,000 people, right? Unless you're like a major university or something, but you can send a highly customized email to 10,000 people, right? But it's different skill sets, different tools, different ways of thinking. And to send highly customized emails to tens or hundreds of thousands of people does take some tech skills, right?
It does, yes.
Whereas to like maintain like 150 high touch relationships takes
Right.
coffee going skills and,
Yes.
call skills, networking skills, tracking people's, storytelling skills,
Right.
confidence skills. You don't need confidence skills to send a great email, but you
Yeah.
do to show up and like sell your vision, to somebody,
Right.
or engage them in your vision is probably a
Mhm.
better term.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's so interesting about that client of yours. So I know I kind of
Or or
interjected in about, what donor teams face, what challenges they're facing. Anything
Yes.
you want to add to that list?
Well, I think one of the other things that I see so often is I kind of call it like a comms circus. Like it feels like a circus, not that it is one, but it feels like it. So I always think of it from the internal staff person. And do they feel like they're scrambling 24/7? Like they just can't keep up. I hear that a lot. Like, oh my gosh, it's always something. It's another piece to create. It's the social, it's the videos, it's the events, it's the campaigns. And you can just hear that anxiety in there. And this is a big, like we just talked about, is a bigger problem if you only have one person who is doing all that. Plus, they're supposed to be doing all these relationship things. Like, it's just too much. So, I guess what I see there is that there is a need for the tools so that the team's efforts can be maximized. One of the best things that I've seen to help with that is to have a super robust case for support narrative so that you can take that internal copy and say, okay, we need a campaign. What's our theme for this year? But then pull it right out of that case and meld it for the theme or for whatever you're writing. And it just gets you farther along. It's sort of like better than AI because you're not starting with a blank page, but it is your copy. It's not something that somebody else made up for you. It's your copy. It's what you want to say, and it gets you started. And I've just seen teams say, oh my gosh, an inner report that used to take us 6 weeks to write, we got it all done in just a few days because we could just pull from it and put our new stories around it. And we already knew how to say everything we wanted to say that was that high level mission vision stuff. You don't have to spin and keep working and start with from zero every single time. So I think that helps because a lot of nonprofit teams are small. Like you need these tools to get things moving so that you don't feel like every day is a scramble. And that's just no fun. No one wants to feel that way at their work.
I've been thinking about that recently, thinking about, in the for profit world, we have something called, content marketing. And inside content marketing, there's this very well established, highly effective for a really long time now concept of creating pillar content or pillar
Right.
pages
Right.
on your website, where basically
Yeah.
you might have like two or three, sometimes even just one kind of core topic that you're an
Yes.
expert on as a nonprofit, and you create a very well written, like really long page or
Yeah.
guide. And honestly, the page and the guide can be the same thing, except one's a PDF and one's on
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
website,
Right.
right? And
Right.
it's like, 5,000 words, 10,000 words, like it's a lot of words. And it becomes this
Yeah.
core piece of content. And then from there, you now can
Exactly.
create, you can go live and talk about them. You can create social clips. You can create shorter posts. You can create emails. And now you have something to get rather than say to like, AI, write something for me. You can say,
Right.
take this
Right.
thing that I already wrote about and turn it into a social post. And then you're going to get such
Right.
better content out of it. And you can just
Yeah.
keep using, I said I had a webinar on staffing. I kind of have, three pillar pieces, one about how to have a system to run your nonprofit to solve what I call the
Yes.
whack-a-mole
Yes.
problem, which we were basically just
Yep.
describing. Nonprofit leaders, they kind of know how to do each thing. They just can't get it all done at the same time. Then there's like how to make a board that actually works, and my thinking around
That's
that, and
needed.
that we
Yep.
actually are using a board model that was never designed to work well, and therefore it doesn't. And then my third is around bringing, fun, adding staff. Actually, a four at this point, right? You do it enough years, and you get more and more
Right.
pillars. So I have
More
one
things.
around adding staff and how to do that, and how
Yeah.
important that is, and how to afford doing that. And then the last one now is around fundraising, even though I'm not a fundraising expert, but this concept that we talked about of there are different
Oh,
methods
yeah.
of fundraising and they have different
Yep.
returns on investment. And you need to
Yep.
build one at a time. And sometimes you only need to build one or two. I call them machines. And if you focus on the
Right.
highest return on investment activities, you'll be
Yep.
pretty well set up for success. So at this point, I have a webinar on each one of those. It's like a long webinar. And from that, I've got like, probably 5, 10 years worth of content, right? By
Oh
having
my
all
gosh, it's so
those
great, isn't it?
pillar pieces. Yeah.
Yes.
You need me to write a
Yep.
report or write a book, like it'd be like, okay, it's all been said before and we're just
Yes.
assembling at this point.
And it's so much easier for a whole team because your nonprofit should have a voice and everyone writes a little bit differently, which is fine as long as you're all within the guardrails of like, oh, we're all going to talk this way about our mission and we're going to use these phrases. And if you have a touchstone piece, this internal document that you can pull from, everyone's at least sounding the same, even though you might have different people writing and sending messages and engaging with donors. At least you're all saying, we're going to at least talk about these things the same. And it may come out a little bit differently because of personality or context or whatever, but at least the donors are hearing a consistent message time after time. That is such a huge help to teams.
We're going to take a quick break and then I have
Mhm.
some more questions for you. I want to shift over towards donor engagement. I wanted to share that I'm here to bring you guests like Erin in these podcasts. But in addition to that, I have been an executive director, a board member, and a coach and trainer to many, many nonprofits. And I know how busy you are and how hard it can be when you're facing that whack-a-mole problem to keep all the important leadership stuff top of mind, which is why, in addition to this podcast, I'm now creating for you the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you will get super concise, actionable tips each week in your inbox. And you can access that by going to inspirednonprofitleadership.com. All right. Let's get back to my conversation. Let's talk about engagement, right? Because the money comes in when we have people engaging with us. And maybe even we could frame it and, how do you increase engagement with people who want to be high touch, right? If we're doing that kind of low tech, high touch.
Yeah.
And how do we get engagement? What steps are the same or different if we want to get engagement in kind of a scaled format?
Well, I love all the things that we've already been talking about in terms of like what types of activities are you investing with different types of donors. And so this really comes down to a really strong donor segmentation strategy. And then part of that would be what are the different groups? We talked about labeling our groups, kind of getting donors in a collective so that we can really approach them in similar ways. It doesn't have to be all cookie cutter, but just maximize your efforts and make sure there's some economies of scale there because you can't talk to all 10,000 donors in the same way. Um, that donor engagement strategy, though, so often what I see is that you have a strategy and you think, okay, we want to talk to higher touch donors like this and lower touch donors like this. But then what happens is so many teams end up spending so much of their time and effort on all of the low touch things because they take forever. I just always, as much as social is needed, all the platforms and all the things like that is a full-time job. And so then when you try to do that, it takes away all the energy and effort that you might have to do some one-on-one relationship building with the higher touch. So how do you balance this out? I mean, that is the question, right? So yeah, how do you balance that out? What I like to do is I like to think of each segment and then make sure that you really do have a clear donor journey of sorts. So you're saying, our donors are here. And over the course of, I always just use a calendar year because it's mentally easy. Where are we going? What do we want them to do? What do we want them to know? What do we want them to feel? What do we want them to experience? And actually write those things down. I think there's that jump of like we kind of know we want donors to go somewhere, but what is it? Like write it down. Maybe you're a little bit off, but you can change that up for next year. You can learn. And so write down what are the steps? What do we want them to know? And then how do you think you can help with that? What types of communications? What types of one-on-one conversations? What type of events? Try to think through what would that look like for each of these segments and then decide we've got 4 segments, 5 segments, 6. How much time will it take to execute these donor journeys and making sure that, again, looking back at the high ROI, you've got to make sure that you're taking care of people and not spending too much time on one platform, such as a social. It's needed, but you've got to figure out a way to execute that much more quickly by using your content better, recycling content, um, being speedy and saying, hey, social is kind of like old school radio. You're there and it's out. Either you're going to see it at the moment or you won't. Like, unless it then goes viral, that'd be awesome. But you're spending too much time on things that are going to be here and gone. And you need to spend more time on those evergreen elements and the relationships that you can build that will have the longevity for donor support.
That makes so much sense. I think so often, not especially if, I say smaller nonprofit, but really there is more types of fundraising and fundraising activities, and even the largest of nonprofits could handle all of, and even very large nonprofits, have been shown they focus on one primary type of fundraising activity to
Right.
bring in, 90%, really cover their operational costs. And I think being not trying to do it all, just because you see your friend nonprofit doing it doesn't mean you should do it too. I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many clients who need to be focused on building relationships. I've told, like, you need to stop doing like Giving Tuesday
Yes.
because you don't
Yes.
have the
Oh my
staff for it.
goodness.
You don't have the campaign tech. Like, you
Yeah.
don't like doing it. And yet it sucks up like 2 months of your year for like
Yeah.
$3,000, right? Like,
Right.
you got to
Right.
shift. It's always about, I think, to bring this to, like, for leaders out there listening who maybe even aren't doing their own fundraising, you always need to be thinking about your resource allocation.
Yes.
Hopefully you don't have such limited resources. That's something I'd like to change in the sector, but
Mm-hmm.
it's never going to be infinite resources, right? And so you
Yeah.
always need to be mindful. If you're doing one thing, there's something else you're not doing. And so always asking
Exactly.
that question, is this the best thing I can be doing? A client recently asked me, should I go to this convention and spend $3,000 on a booth? And I said, the question you should be asking is, what's the best way to spend $3,000?
Yeah.
And they immediately were like, not that convention. I was like, well, there's your
Answer.
answer,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So I think we always need to think about what's the best way to spend our staff's
Yeah.
time. Is it on that, Giving Tuesday campaign? Is it on your annual report? I think annual reports, like you said, can be great, but
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of organizations focusing on their annual reports when they've got almost nobody to give it to, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
this is
Right.
not a tool for new donors, right? We're not going to bring new people in the door probably with our annual report. This is something that, is for existing people to celebrate and be proud of, like what you said, what they helped accomplish.
Yes.
But if you
Yes.
don't have that many days, you don't need to spend a ton of time, right? You might as well just call each one
Right.
and have an individual conversation, because it would take you less time
So
than
true.
creating
Yes.
that annual report was. If you've got like 10 or 15 or even 20, kind of higher level donors, just call them.
Mhm.
That will work way better than, some sort of fancy PDF that they could get.
Even with thinking through the best use of funds and staffing issues and what activities should you be doing, I find that to be a large part of what my work is with clients, is helping them to think through, almost like giving them permission to not do things, because there are so many things you can do, but you don't need to do all of them. And that's where that strategy component comes in, is having that bigger vision of, okay, we're going to try to accomplish these things in these ways, which automatically means you're not going to do some other things. That strategy frees up your team, but then knowing what that strategy can be or should be, that's when really you need experts like what you're doing is helping with that. And what I do with communications and with donor engagement, it's like, I am going to help you say, we're not going to do that this year. We're going to put that to the side. It's okay to do something different and to take a little bit of that chance, like what we've talked about before.
So what are some of the things? I know it's different for everybody, right? And you really should, if you're not sure what things to put on your plate or take off, you should get some
Yeah.
expert support because you're going to save so much time and money doing
Yeah.
that. But I'd love to know from you, just to get people's minds going, what are some of the common things you find yourself telling people to take off their
Yeah.
plates?
Well, always looking at how many social channels are you trying to manage. Knowing your donors, find the one that's the best fit for them and use it. You don't have to be everywhere doing all the things. So that's a huge one. Another one would be, how are you using different types of communication? So for a campaign, for instance, um, not every campaign has to be for all of the donors. You can have specific campaigns to reach donors who are primarily email based or social based. You could have another campaign that is primarily the one on one conversation based. Um, those types of campaigns, I'm not saying creating whole new campaigns. I'm just saying be specific of what are you trying to have these people do and what are you trying to have these people do and understand, so that the outcome is a little bit more specific for that audience. It'll save you time and effort instead of saying everybody's getting everything and then the response is so low because it's like you tried to be everything to all people. That's not good. Um, Another thing is even just trying to do too many types of communications. Um, I am a fan for these foundational key types of communications that need to go out because you need consistency, you need frequency, you need things to be clear and compelling as you're communicating all year long. But I also see that very often, like take an annual report for an example, it's like, okay, we got the annual report and it's the one print piece we're doing for the year. So let's stick everything in there. And then we're going to try to make it be everything. And then pretty much it becomes nothing. So it's okay to invest on certain things and say, this is our key print piece a year. We love it. Great. Make it the best. Do the one. But it's okay then to say the rest of the year, we're going to primarily do some emails and maybe do some letters to top people, engagement people who want that more one-on-one experience. There are lots of different ways to do that. And it's okay to say no to some things so that you can do other things better.
Well, before we wrap up, any final kind of tips, advice, words of wisdom, and then also for folks who are interested in getting some help from you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Well, my favorite tip here is all coming back to core messaging, because I think there's a consistency that comes when you have all your core message components in place. So your case for support, your branding, and part of your planning and execution. Once all of that is in place, it just makes everything run a little bit better. So my recommendation is get those core pieces in place so that your team has a fighting chance. So if you are running an org and your team is struggling, maybe run through a checklist, which I'm realizing that is my freebie download right now on my website. If you go to my website, erinstraza.com, you can download a core messaging checklist and it'll just help you to run through, like, do we have these things? What do we need and why? And maybe shore those things up so that you can help your team to be more effective in their donor engagement and then bring on the donors who are the most thrilled and excited to partner with you financially.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for being with us and your incredible tips. It's really been a pleasure, and we'll have those links for anybody who is driving or whatever, and we'll have them in the show notes for you. It's been such a pleasure. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself. Take time for self-care. Take some time to get those fundraising, donor engagement basics in place, because oftentimes slowing down for a moment to get your fundamentals really pays off many times over in the future. And be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.